Lenin built the party which actually overthrew capitalism, which actually carried out the program described in the Communist Manifesto.
The thing is with the CPUSA, it almost felt like they were communists in name. They were more concerned with making sure Democrats get elected locally. I don't know about Leninism being huge within the CPUSA.
And I didn't really know much about Lenin beforehand, but, after joining the party, there's an absolute need for every single serious revolutionary to understand the ideas of Lenin and to apply them today.
Get organized. There is a party that's being built. If we don't organize and fight now, we're going to miss the boat for this generation of communists.
Здравствует братское доверие и боевой союз рабочих всех наций в борьбе за свержение капитала.
Vladimir Lenin was the greatest revolutionary in history. He created the Bolshevik Party, which led the working class to power in the Russian Revolution of 1917. Lenin may have died 100 years ago, but if you've listened to any of our podcasts recently, you know that there are millions of Americans who hate capitalism and want to end it. That is the current relevance of Lenin and Leninism. And to explain more about why we're founding a Leninist party and what that means, we have Bryce Gordon here with us today.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, well, for so many young people, the most burning political question is how can we successfully carry out a revolution? How can we overthrow capitalism in our lifetime? And it actually goes beyond just the layer of society that's outright communist. There's widespread discontent. Just to give one of many possible examples, there was this poll taken in 2022. The New York Times published an article about it. They said a majority of American voters across nearly all demographics and ideologies believe their system of government does not work. And it went on to explain that 58% of those interviewed said that the world's oldest independent constitutional democracy needs major reforms or a complete overhaul. And so that speaks volumes to the mood and the direction of U.S. society.
We're talking about 6 in 10 Americans basically saying they think the government should go. And the Constitution itself, which is obviously a very sort of sacred thing in the American psychology, that even that is failing, right? So very significant.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the communist layer of society, they're asking, how do we carry out a socialist revolution? How do we organize successfully to make that happen? Lenin answered this question in practice. That's the significance of the Russian Revolution. I think it's difficult sometimes for us to really imagine and understand what a seismic shift that represented. But, imagine here in the US, the working class, the vast majority of society, the bus drivers, the cashiers, teachers, nurses, truckers, the working class taking power, overthrowing the rule of the banks and the corporations and building workers' democracy. That's what happened in Russia in 1917.
And that is why so many people are looking to Lenin, are inspired by Lenin, and want to act on the basis of the principles of Leninism. Often we receive messages, when people write in asking to get involved to help build the party of the Revolutionary Communists of America. And a lot of those messages reference Lenin, Leninism.
From a very young age, I've been incredibly frustrated with the limitations of capitalist thinking. I today consider myself a Marxist, not because my eyes have been opened to the philosophy, but simply because Marxism perfectly aligns with my own. Never have I felt more validated in my own personal beliefs than when I first read Lenin. Nothing would make me happier than to see the end of U.S. imperial hegemony.
I really like this message that we got from someone in Lexington, Tennessee. A very thoughtful message.
Learning of and about Marxism has saved my life. I wish nothing more than to give everything I can to this cause. In pursuit of this, I have already begun local agitation, education, and organization as prescribed by Lenin. I have made 3 comrades where I work, and I will be educating them about this party tomorrow and encouraging them to take the time to consider joining. What I want in this world is to help our people grow as a society, to help our people not be alienated, exploited, and abused by the parasitic bourgeoisie who get their wealth and power from siphoning off the wealth of the labor of the people, as Marx spoke in Wage, Labor, and Capital. I am wholly dedicated to the task of praxis, to the education of those around me, and to the betterment of our society, our species, and our planet. I wish nothing more than to be able to give my time and labor to a movement, to our party, which will herald the changing of our country into something that serves the masses.
So people are reading Lenin and taking example from him. The next message we wanted to show is from someone from Albuquerque, New Mexico, which, as I understand it, that's where you're from, Bryce?
Yes. And this person from Albuquerque, where we now have a cell, says,
I was radicalized during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm a healthcare worker, and I've seen firsthand what happens to patients, providers, and other healthcare workers when we put profits over people. I read Marx, Lenin, and Rosa Luxemburg. I'm tired of sitting on my ass and listening to podcasts.
And I think this describes another very common sentiment that we've seen, which is that a lot of people are being radicalized online, and they're trying to search for answers to figure out where to go from here, what's next. And in that environment, I think there's a lot of confusion, often a lot of people throwing terms around Leninism, Marxism, Marxist-Leninism, Marxist-Leninism, Maoism, Trotskyism, Stalinism. And it feels often pretty superficial, often quite petty, sort of inward-looking, kind of like different cliques of people arguing with each other. And the aim of this podcast is we want to cut across that confusion. This is not a podcast to just add to the discussion. We want to put forward the genuine methods of Leninism and not just discuss them, but put them into practice, which we are doing right now through the founding of the Party of the Revolutionary Communists of America. And so I guess it would be good to clarify what kind of party we're building, because we have received, a lot of comments on our YouTube videos and our social media of people asking, so what is the Revolutionary Communists of America? Are you guys Leninists? What kind of party is this?
Yeah, well, we're definitely a Leninist party. We study Lenin, we study the experience of the Russian Revolution. And we're also Leninists because Leninism is really nothing more than the continuation and elaboration of Marxism. It's not like a separate strain or a variant or something, but it's actually putting the ideas of Marxism in practice and to their full conclusions, basically. Lenin built the party which actually overthrew capitalism, which actually carried out the program described in the Communist Manifesto. Lenin is definitely one of the great Marxist theoreticians. Sometimes there's this idea that Marx was the theoretician and then Lenin was just like an activist or something who put the ideas into practice. That's definitely not true. Lenin wrote a wide range of theoretical works over his life.
And it's also not true, by the way, that Marx was just a theoretician.
Yeah.
Marx and Engels, their whole lives were fighting to establish a working class party and movement and to actually carry out the communist revolution. Mm-hmm. Marx and Engels founded the First International and the Second International, which Lenin was a part of until, their betrayal, their opportunism, and then Lenin broke from that and founded the Third International. But point being, you cannot be a Marxist and just be a theoretician. The whole point, Marx explained it, is that philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it.
Yeah, definitely. And if you read the Communist Manifesto, you get an excellent summary of what the political program of Marxism is. For one thing, Marx foresaw that capitalism was just a passing stage in human history. That's one of the remarkable things about that document, is that it was written as capitalism was still coming into being, still expanding. But he was able to see what role it was playing historically and also how it was laying the groundwork for the working class to eventually overthrow it. He explains that capitalism centralizes the scattered means of production. In other words, it creates large-scale industry, it develops technology, and it also creates the working class. It creates its own gravediggers. It creates the class that can withhold its labor and therefore sweep aside capitalism once it's conscious of that power. And so Marx, in the Communist Manifesto, says,
"The first step in the revolution of the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class."
And then he goes on and explains what that means.
"The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest, by degrees, all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e. of the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total of productive forces as rapidly as possible."
And when we look at the Russian Revolution, we see that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what the Bolsheviks, the program that they won the Russian working class to, is to overthrow capitalism entirely and start planning the economy. And that's what we fight for today. That's the task in the 21st century still.
Yeah, there's no doubt that today the means of production have been enormously developed by capitalism, as Marx himself foresaw. It's created a worldwide division of labor, huge productive capacity. And so there's already the economic basis for a world of superabundance, right? Even today, there's already enough homes for the amount of homeless people. There's more than enough food being produced, and yet there's millions and millions of people who go hungry every day. And not to speak of things like, all the technology that's been produced that could, say, resolve the climate catastrophe that's not being put to use because of private ownership of the means of production, because production is being carried out for profit and not for the benefit of humanity. And so that's our task today is still fundamentally the same, even though 100 years have passed since Lenin's death. And even though it's been nearly 180 years since Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, the fundamental task remains the same, which is for the working class to take over the running of the economic production democratically.
Yeah, definitely. And to concretize this for U.S. listeners, imagine taking over the Fortune 500 companies and placing them under state ownership and workers' control and management, and then using those industries to plan the economy. Those 500 companies alone produce 2/3 of the U.S. GDP, but it's run anarchically. Each company is run for profit, not according to any common plan for society. And so what we fight for is to bring all of that under a rational plan, to harness that technology. And this idea is really taking hold among an important layer of society.
And just to give you an example, one of these people who wrote in asking to join said the following.
I want to bring about global communism for the betterment of our collective society. The idea of actually planning and executing an efficient economy excites me more than I can explain.
I think that sums it up quite well.
Absolutely. And Marx also, he laid out this political program, and he also talked in the second chapter of the Communist Manifesto about basically the need for a party, because he asks the reader, how do the communists relate to the working class as a whole?
The communists are, on the one hand, practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country, that section which pushes forward all others. On the other hand, theoretically, they have, over the great mass of the proletariat, the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement.
Lenin had unique insight and clarity on the need to build that party long in advance, and also what that party needed to look like. And I think that's key to his success. For instance, in 1901, he wrote a famous article called Where to Begin, a landmark article in the history of the Bolshevik Party. Because essentially up to that time, there had been decentralized Marxist circles popping up all over Russia. There had been a strike wave in the 1890s and a growth of the working class. And so these ideas were starting to take hold, but it wasn't centralized on a national level. There wasn't a centralized revolutionary party. And Lenin was fighting to build that kind of party. And so he wrote a series of articles and also his book, What Is to Be Done, where he laid out why this is politically necessary. And in Where to Begin, he says,
the building of a fighting organization and the conduct of political agitation are essential under any drab, peaceful circumstances in any period, no matter how marked by a declining revolutionary spirit. Moreover, it is precisely in such periods and under such circumstances that work of this kind is particularly necessary, since it is too late to form the organization in times of explosions and outbursts. The party must be in a state of readiness to launch activity at a moment's notice.
Having that clarity in 1901 and driving the construction of the Bolshevik Party was absolutely key for then being prepared in 1917 to win the working class of the program of communism.
Yeah, because what Lenin is saying there is that when revolutions break out, when mass uprisings break out, the mass of the population rising up out in the streets, if you don't have a party before those things happen, it's too late to build a party in the midst of that, right? All the years of preparation of building the Bolshevik Party ahead of 1917 participating in the 1905 revolution, and all the debates and discussions, all the work they did to win over the more advanced sections of the working class, to train those layers theoretically, right? To actually study the ideas of Marxism, learn how to agitate. Then, when 1917 hits, those cadre, those revolutionary fighters, that skeleton of a revolutionary party is activated and can actually have an influence and can actually win over an even broader section of the population, which of course at the end was the majority of society, which is what allowed them to take power in October of 1917.
Yeah, it truly is amazing to read about this. I've recently been reading the new book, In Defense of Lenin, by Rob Sewell and Alan Woods, and I feel more inspired, more amazed than ever by the accomplishment of the Russian Revolution. Lenin and the Bolsheviks, they foresaw that capitalism would prepare this type of event, a revolution. Well, in 1917, Russia had been involved in World War I for 3 years. Initially, there was support among the population for World War I, but that turned into extreme discontent, extreme misery throughout the experience of the war. And so eventually, all this discontent reached a tipping point, and a revolution broke out. The Bolsheviks actually did not play a significant role in the first revolution that happened that year. It was a revolution that overthrew Tsarism and implemented basically a parliamentary democracy. But Lenin was able to see that new government was a capitalist government, and it was going to continue the war. It was not going to actually solve the problems that had mobilized the masses in the first place. And so the Bolsheviks started out as a fringe party. They got maybe 1 or 2% support in the Soviets. But they understood that the provisional government that had been created was not going to end the war, was not going to solve the problems facing the masses, was not going to give land to the peasants. And so they kept explaining the need for a socialist revolution. And by September, they had won a decisive majority of the working class of that program. It's reflected in the growth of the party. They started with 8,000 members in January of that year, and incredibly, it mushroomed out to 400,000 by September of 1917, and in turn, they were reaching millions of people. And so they were able to win the Russian working class to the program of socialism. Their slogans, among others, were all power to the Soviets. In other words, down with the provisional government. We need a workers' government with workers' councils forming the basis for it. And they successfully overthrew the provisional government and ushered in the first workers' state in history.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the slogans that resonated with all of society, including the peasantry, which was the majority of the population in Russia at the time, was also the question of land, which you mentioned, the question of bread,
yes,
because of mass starvation as a result of the war, and the question of peace, which is basically ending the war, the slaughter of Russian workers and peasants that were fighting in the front for the interests of Russian imperialism, right?
And I think one of the key dynamics for understanding the Russian Revolution is basically that Lenin and the Bolsheviks understood that the new provisional government was a capitalist government, and so it was not going to end the war. It was not going to give land to the peasants. It was not going to solve the problems facing the Russian masses. And so Lenin had been in exile, but he came back to Russia in April, and he explained, we need a second revolution. We need a socialist revolution. He came over to the position that Trotsky had been advocating since about 1905, which is that the coming Russian Revolution could not just stop at the bourgeois revolution. It needed to become a socialist revolution. And so Lenin rearmed the party to that perspective, which is also linked necessarily to the perspective of world revolution. And they saw their victory in October as the first in an international chain of revolutions, the first success in the world socialist revolution.
Yeah, he expressed very well that the chain of world capitalism broke at its weakest link. Mm-hmm. But then the idea was that would be the spark of revolutions in the most advanced capitalist countries, which did happen, right?
Right.
Germany to Italy to Finland to Britain, one after the other. You actually had uprisings, general strikes. But I guess one question that comes up is, okay, so World War I, that led to a revolution over a century ago. But we don't have those conditions today. So how could there possibly be a revolution in the US? Often the US is portrayed like there's a widespread sentiment of like American exceptionalism, like the US is special. The workers here, they have higher living standard. They have a comfortable life. They don't need to fight for those things. And revolution will never happen.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely true that the US enjoyed an exceptionally long period of relative prosperity and stability in the past. But that's come to an end. It's not coming back. It can't be willed into existence by capitalist politicians. And I think if you look at the broad trajectory of US society over the last 15 years in particular, it's very clear that a revolution is being prepared. It's clear that the class struggle is back on the agenda. It's clear that the working class, after a long period of slumber, is reawakening and just starting to fight again. Recently, there was an article in the New York Times, and it was basically the gist of it was Biden promised a return to normality, but the world wouldn't cooperate. And it talks about how that was Biden's campaign promise, but then you have the ongoing Ukraine war, you have Israel's genocidal war on Gaza, the inflationary crisis, which continues. It's not a question of which specific capitalist politician is in power, but the trajectory of the system as a whole. And world capitalism has entered into a terminal crisis. It's in a profound state of decline and instability. And the way revolution develops is basically that it builds gradually and almost imperceptibly beneath the surface of society, and then eventually it bursts to the fore at some point. Trotsky talked about this as being a molecular process, the molecular process of revolution. And Lenin too, even Lenin, for all his confidence in the coming world revolution, he himself observed, he was speaking in 1918,
2 months before January 1905 or February 1917, no revolutionary, whatever his experience and knowledge, however familiar with the life of the people, could have foreseen that Russia would be shaken by such explosions.
And so it really is like a volcanic eruption or an earthquake or boiling water. It seems still, and then there's a tipping point. Suddenly, everything changes, and that's what's happening already across the world right now.
Yeah, I think even in 1917, while Lenin was still in exile, he was giving a lecture in Switzerland, and he said something like, I know my generation is very unlikely or will not live to see the coming revolution, but it's up to you, the young new generations, you need to prepare for that task. And then just a few weeks later or days later, 1917 erupts in February, and he has to find a way to rush back to Russia to play a role in those events. So that shows.
And 9 months later, he was in power.
Exactly. It can happen very suddenly, very explosively, and it's something that's prepared by capitalism itself, exerting every single day just this grinding pressure on regular working class people who eventually just can't take it anymore, and all of that anger explodes into the surface. And I don't think we should be talking abstractly or theoretically about this, because there's example after example of recent revolutions, of recent mass uprisings, mass movements that are just, total confirmations of everything that we're saying and everything that Marx, Engels, Lenin, and others predicted in the past. Even just in the US, in 2020, we saw the largest mass movement in the history of the US after the police murder of George Floyd, which brought over 10% of the population into the streets, millions of people in every single city and town of this country.
Mass protests here in the United States have sparked a global movement against racial discrimination.
Federal agents sent to restore order in Portland.
When I say this ain't a riot, say this a revolution. This ain't a riot. This ain't a riot. This ain't a riot.
NBC News confirms President Trump was rushed to an underground bunker as protesters tried to climb over barriers outside the White House.
I mean, no one would have expected 2 days before George Floyd was murdered that within a week you'd have protests spreading to hundreds of cities, millions of people in the streets. That would have sounded impossible, but this is a perfect example of all that societal discontent, all of these pressures of capitalism And one more catalyst, one more event which exposed capitalism was enough to bring this mass movement to the fore. And there's other examples too, like in Sri Lanka, the Sri Lankan revolution in 2022, the Sudanese revolution in 2019. In both of these cases, the masses moved to take matters into their own hands, essentially. Capitalism was suspended. The possibility was there for the working class to take power. In fact, in Sri Lanka, the protesters were even swimming in the pool of the presidential palace.
And they swarmed into the office of a president already fled. At street level, security forces attempted to hold the line. Police have the gas, riot police have the water cannon, but the people of Sri Lanka have the numbers, and they've had enough. Media footage appeared to show the presidential motorcade speeding away from the palace, leaving the presidential palace storm, helping themselves to the private swimming pool and its delights. Governments around the world should be watching.
Over the last few years, we've seen revolutions in Ecuador. We've seen revolutionary movements and uprisings in places like Chile and many, many others. In Iran, just 2 years ago, right, you had the mass movement over the killing of Mahsa Amini. So all of these things are proof that revolutions are literally on the agenda today. But in every single one of these cases, there wasn't a revolutionary leadership up to the task. For example, in the Sudanese revolution, that's a very advanced example because you actually had, during the protests, there were councils that were organized, strike committees to plan, basically society, to plan provisioning of food, to plan like healthcare. And the demands were for the government to be overthrown altogether and to be replaced with a council of the people.
This revolution remains undimmed. If anything, it's growing. Thousands upon thousands are still on the streets of Khartoum in a show of raucous celebration and utter determination. They've got more than they expected, but now they want the lot. The complete overthrow of the military regime here and a new civilian council of leaders. That could be difficult to achieve. But these demonstrations are organised by the street. Volunteers man the barricades, and they run their own security. Doctors and nurses man a 24-hour emergency hospital. This is a people's uprising, and it's noticeable how many women are fully involved, constantly keeping a vigil on the streets.
Unfortunately, the leadership, they were not Marxists, they were not communists, and they actually ended up capitulating and giving power back to the army, which led to bloody counter-revolution, bloody repression in the months following those events.
Imagine if you had had modern-day Bolsheviks in those committees in Sudan arguing for a workers' government, winning increasing layers of the population to that program. Capitalism could have been overthrown in Sudan. That would happen in 2019 when there was enormous discontent all over the world. That would have been a beacon. It would have set an example and immediately posed the question of spreading the revolution. But all of history proves Lenin correct, that without a party, the working class cannot take power. In the case of the George Floyd movement, within a few weeks of heroic but spontaneous and therefore directionless protests across the country, it kind of dissipated. The Democrats then tried to co-opt what they could from the movement, and nothing really came of that. In the case of Sudan and Sri Lanka, capitalism remains, the regimes were reestablished. And it all brings to mind Lenin's writings on the role of the party. For instance, in Where to Begin, he's talking about the recent wave of class struggle in Russia.
With our own eyes, we saw that the mass of workers and common people of the towns pressed forward in struggle, while the revolutionaries lacked a staff of leaders and organizers.
And that perfectly describes the dynamic in 2020 in the US, and it perfectly describes the dynamic in so many revolutionary uprisings that have happened over the past century. Nonetheless, history wastes nothing. We need to study all of these experiences to prepare for the future. Capitalism is not going to restabilize itself anytime soon. It's actually continues to enter into more and more profound crisis and contradictions. And so the 2020 movement came and went in the US, but that energy, that discontent, that potential hasn't disappeared. It's back beneath the surface, but it's going to come back again.
And I think Black Lives Matter was a glimpse of the revolutionary potential also in the most important, richest imperialist country in the planet.
Absolutely. A revolution is being prepared in this country and across the world. And we need to prepare it. We need to implement Lenin's ideas. We need to build the Revolutionary Party. And that's why we launched the RCA.
So there's a question of building the party and actually having those people in place. But ultimately, we're talking about the program that the party brings to the table, right? About the ideas, which is the most important element. Ultimately, communism is not just wanting to fight and fighting for the working class in the abstract, but having an understanding of how capitalism came to be and what conscious role workers need to play to run society, which is not an easy matter. We take it very seriously, and we cannot take a frivolous attitude toward that. So I guess one question is, you mentioned Lenin as a theoretician.
Right.
So what was the attitude of the Bolshevik Party to questions of theory, and what role did theory play in the movement?
Well, yeah, Lenin famously said in What Is to Be Done, without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. And that sums up his approach quite well. He constantly emphasized the need to build a party, but equally important to him was building the party on correct theoretical lines and being extremely precise on all questions of theory. The reason for this is because mistakes in theory, or a lack of clarity in theory, inevitably is going to lead to mistakes in practice and directionlessness in practice. And so the two are linked. The military staff of any capitalist country doesn't take a frivolous attitude towards history, for instance. They study history and military theory, and the same thing applies for the class war. There's been 200 or so years of struggle against capitalism. And if we take a serious attitude towards distilling that and drawing the lessons, then you can build a party that isn't just going about things blindly, that is actually informed by what has and hasn't worked in the past. And so Lenin emphasized this also in Left-Wing Communism, which is a book he wrote in 1920 to arm the leaderships of the communist parties across the world, the Communist International. And so he wrote about kind of some of the fundamental components of Bolshevism. And he says that Bolshevism arose on the granite foundation of Marxist theory. And he talks about how decades of trying many other theories had passed. Eventually, the Russian workers' movement arrived at Marxism through suffering, through trial, and then built that party with a very serious attitude towards theory.
Lenin was actually often accused by the leaders of the Second International of just quarreling over theory and infighting, as opposed to just focusing on unity and building a large party. Of course, by then, the Second International, the German party and so forth, had degenerated into opportunism, into reformism. That was the parties that ended up capitulating when World War I broke out. They actually supported the war efforts. So that really shows how mistakes in theory absolutely lead to mistakes in practice. And what is the point of building a party if it ends up having the wrong ideas, as opposed to it being a tool for the class struggle, for the working class to overthrow capitalism? It ends up being diverted into basically betraying the movement. So ideological clarity is absolutely key. And I think we get the same accusations today sometimes, especially in those online milieus where people are like, well, yeah, Trotskyism, Leninism, Stalinism, anarchism, like there's all this infighting, but ultimately it doesn't really matter. There's like small differences. We can agree on what we agree on and just all get together. But that is absolutely the incorrect attitude. It's an amateurish attitude. It's actually a very frivolous approach that is unserious and is going to be totally insufficient to actually carry out the tasks ahead, which are it's a monumental task, which is the overthrow of a system that has dominated the world for over 2 centuries. And Lenin actually summed this up very well in the declaration of the editorial board of Iskra.
Before we can unite, and in order that we may unite, we must first of all draw firm and definite lines of demarcation. Otherwise, our unity will be purely fictitious, and it will conceal the prevailing confusion and binder its radical elimination.
And going back to the point that we made earlier, that Leninism is not a separate tendency, but just a continuation of Marxism.
This tendency can be expressed by the word Marxism, and there is hardly need to add that we stand for the consistent development of the ideas of Marx and Engels and emphatically reject the equivocating, vague, opportunist corrections.
In What is to be Done, Lenin also makes this very important point about why theory is necessary to combat the capitalist class. In capitalist society, the dominant ideas are the ideas of the capitalist class. They have control of the media, the universities, the whole system organically ensures that basically capitalist ideology is prevalent. And so Lenin explains basically that the workers' movement doesn't exist in a vacuum. He says,
"The only choice is either bourgeois or socialist ideology. There is no middle course, for mankind has not created a third ideology, and, moreover, in a society torn by class antagonisms, there can never be a non-class or an above-class ideology. Hence, to belittle the socialist ideology in any way, to turn aside from it in the slightest degree, means to strengthen the bourgeois ideology. But why, the reader will ask, does the spontaneous movement, the movement along the line of least resistance, lead to the domination of bourgeois ideology? For the simple reason that bourgeois ideology is far older in origin than socialist ideology, that it is more fully developed, and that it has at its disposal immeasurably more means of dissemination."
And so he's polemicizing against a trend that existed at the time, which basically just fetishized the spontaneous movements of the working class, and in practice said, all we really need to do is support the spontaneous movements that arise, put forth bread and butter demands. They accused Lenin and his followers of overrating ideology. In other words, putting too much time and effort and focus on theory and theoretical precision instead of just supporting the movement.
Yeah, and I think that really makes you think of, today, for example, sometimes we get criticized for showing up to protests with our own slogans, our own banners, with, our newspaper, which the aim of bringing those tools is to disseminate the program that we think will advance the movement. But people sometimes just want to pander to the lowest common denominator, or they say, all you need to do is show up, and support the movement. Well, for us, what it means to support the movement is to actually, fight for the kinds of program and ideas that we think will bring it to its full conclusion, which is the overthrow of capitalism, the working class taking power ultimately. So we want to raise the sights of the movement to that point.
Yeah, it's also worth noting that throughout the lead up to the Russian Revolution, throughout his whole life, at every important turn in the situation, Lenin went back to the basics, went back to Marxist theory, Marxist philosophy, to deepening his understanding of Marxism. For instance, the 1905 revolution in Russia, it was defeated, and there was a mood of huge pessimism in society and in the Russian socialist movement. The party was decimated numerically. There was a lot of confusion and demoralization. And in this context, a section of the Bolshevik Party was actually breaking with Marxism, essentially. And Lenin took this very seriously. He was in exile. He was abroad. He moved to London to make use of the British Museum to study, to read hundreds of books and write Materialism and Imperial Criticism, his book, which is a defense of philosophical materialism. Also, in World War I, Lenin was in Switzerland, and he took the time to make a deep study of Hegel, to make a study of dialectics. And also in 1917, during a period of ebb in the revolution before the Russian workers actually took power, Lenin was in Finland studying the state, studying the Paris Commune, studying Engels' writings on the task of the socialist revolution in relation to the state, and that's when he wrote his famous book, State and Revolution. And so for him, it wasn't a question of theory or action, but the unity between the two, of using theory as a guide to action. And he took that extremely seriously. It's not an exaggeration to say that without this kind of approach, the Bolsheviks never would have succeeded in overthrowing capitalism.
And think about how mistakes in theory lead to mistakes in practice. The fact that in February, while Lenin was in exile, the leadership of the Bolshevik Party on the ground, which was Stalin and Kamenev, were basically being swayed by public opinion and by all the pressure in Russian society after the revolution to support the provisional government, the capitalist government, they were doing negotiations to enter the government along with the Mensheviks and the social revolutionaries and to basically join into this bourgeois cabinet. What was the name of the government?
Yes, the official name of the provisional government was the Committee for the Reestablishment of Order and Relations with Public Institutions and Personages.
And so Lenin thought, we need to stop this. He wrote the letters from afar, which were actually ignored and basically hidden by Stalin and Kamenev. They didn't want to publish. They thought Lenin had gone mad, that he was in exile. He wasn't in touch with the situation because Lenin was arguing for complete independence. He was saying no support at all for the provisional government and the need to win over the masses and to win the Soviets. But those letters were hidden. They were not distributed. And so Lenin had to rush back as quickly as possible. And that's when he delivered his April thesis to the workers of Russia, really, over the heads of the leadership of the Bolshevik Party. He was prepared to split at that time and say, I will be in a minority of one, but we cannot support the government. So you can see in that moment, there was those pressures of bourgeois ideology to support the bourgeois government. And Stalin and Kamenev, without Lenin's intervention, basically would have just gone ahead and done it. And that is importance of theory. And that is one of the big reasons why Lenin was writing State and Revolution. It was a practical application of the need for the working class to complete that revolution and to actually smash the bourgeois state and establish a worker state. This goes back to the question of class independence, that the working class can only rely on its own methods of struggle, its own forces, parties that represent their interests, which also need to be parties guided by Marxist theory, Marxism being the ideological expression of the working class movement. And so yeah, this question of class independence, I think, is a threat that runs through Marxism, certainly, and through Lenin's life.
Yeah, he constantly sought to imbue the working class with an understanding, basically, that the capitalists are our enemies and no collaboration between the capitalists and the working class in this era is going to work. The capitalists are always going to pursue their interests, which are irreconcilably opposed to the interests of the working class. He said this in so many occasions. One example of this comes from 1917.
The workers must open the eyes of the people to the deception practiced by the bourgeois politicians, teach them to put no faith in words, to depend entirely on their own strength, their own organization, their own unity, and their own weapons.
And Lenin actually comments on this in the American context as well. He wrote an article on the 1912 elections, which is strikingly relevant today. At the time, he said,
"Freedom in the USA is most complete,"
meaning like bourgeois democratic freedom, total freedom of speech for a capitalist country, etc.
And for a whole half-century since the Civil War over slavery in 1860 to 65, two bourgeois parties have been distinguished there by remarkable solidarity and strength. The party of the former slave owners is the so-called Democratic Party. The Capitalist Party, which favored the emancipation of the slaves, has developed into the Republican Party. Since the emancipation of the slaves, the distinction between the two parties has been diminishing. Their fight has not had any serious importance for the mass of the people. The people have been deceived and diverted from their vital interests by means of spectacular and meaningless tools between the two bourgeois parties.
And I'm sure anyone listening to this who's watched U.S. politics really throughout their whole lifetime can relate to this. They choose specific, narrow points of debate, but neither party represents the interests of the working class in any way. And there's some, especially in the past, on the socialist left and still today, who say that we need to go by the logic of lesser evilism. We have to support the Democrats against the Republicans because they're supposedly less bad. But that's absolutely not the case. Both are capitalist parties through and through. Both represent no way forward for the working class. And I would say as Leninists today, we need to bring that class line to the forefront. We need to sharpen and clarify the class line in society and not blur it by giving any degree of support to the Democrats.
Yeah, what a sick joke to vote for Joe Biden as the lesser evil, for Genocide Joe, for the president who's presiding over the massacre of tens of thousands of innocent people in Gaza and funding that massacre, the president who oversaw the culling of the right to abortion in this country, the president who's overseeing the highest inflation. So absolutely, that is not a lesser evil. There's two evils that we can vote for, and it's not because of the subjective qualities of Trump or Biden, but rather because they both represent capitalist interests fundamentally, and the capitalist system itself is a dead end. So this idea that there is a progressive bourgeoisie, we have to thoroughly combat this. There is no wing of the capitalists that is progressive in this period of senile decay of capitalism. And that has been the case for over a century, by the way. Lenin talked about this. This is an idea that actually Stalin applied this question of supporting the progressive bourgeoisie in places like China in 1927, where he advised the Communist Party of China to basically support the bourgeois party of Chiang Kai-shek. And that led to a bloody counter-revolution and the destruction of the Chinese Revolution in that year. And this has been a policy time after time, even in Cuba. The Communist Party in Cuba supported the dictatorship of Batista, the dictator that was overthrown by Fidel Castro in the Cuban Revolution, because it was supposedly this would be the progressive national bourgeoisie. So this goes to show just how anti-Leninist this idea is. It's a total dead end, and especially in the largest imperialist country in the world. I don't know how anyone could possibly conceive of either of the capitalists to be a lesser evil for anyone.
Yeah, no, it's incomprehensible. And amazingly, we must point out that the CPUSA, the Communist Party of the United States, what was the official Communist Party when the Communist International was founded, has for decades, really since World War II and before, has supported the Democrats, and things are no different this upcoming election. This policy is completely in opposition to Marxism, in opposition to Leninism, the most right-wing revisionist possible, so-called communist party that you could possibly find. For instance, a recent article in People's World, the online newspaper of the CPUSA, they published an article called "Biden Bid to Ease Student Debt Unveiled in Key Swing State," which sounds like something you might read in the New York Times. And they go on to praise this new proposal Biden has for student debt. And then they close the article saying, of course, the best guarantee of getting the new plan through is to deliver a resounding defeat to all of the MAGA forces in the November election, from the president on down to every single local lawmaker and judge. So they're a bit shamefaced about it. They don't want to outright say, vote for Biden. They don't maybe want to have like a headline, but you don't even have to read between the lines to see what they're arguing. The logic is, support one wing of the capitalist class against the so-called MAGA wing of the capitalist class. But as you explained, there is no progressive wing of the bourgeoisie at this stage in history. There hasn't been for a very long time. And there's no justification for this kind of class collaborationist policy.
Yeah, it's, I think, really baffling. And I think a lot of people are disillusioned by this. And we've actually received a whole number of people writing in saying that they've been thoroughly disappointed by the CPUSA and that they're looking for a genuine communist party, which is precisely the meaning of our launching the Revolutionary Communists of America, a party that stands unequivocally on the side of the working class, which means rejecting the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party. Just to read a few of these messages, a comrade from Louisiana wrote in saying,
I am not satisfied with CPUSA, and I want a much more revolutionary, Leninist, and radical party, which I feel will lead to a genuine revolution. I have read your manifesto and agree with it. I hold none of the reactionary baggage, and I wish to help build the vanguard. We need a revolution, and I see promise that this party may be ambitious enough to properly become involved with the active relief of the workers today and struggle towards their ultimate liberation as well. I strongly endorse the anti-reformism, as well as the zero tolerance of class collaborationism.
I mean, I couldn't have put it better myself. Someone from Bellingham, Washington said,
I've been disappointed by just about every quote-unquote revolutionary organization I've joined. The Bernie Sanders campaigns, Our Revolution, the DSA, anything I can find to make this sick world a better place. And every one of them has failed. I want to actually challenge the status quo. I want to actually end capitalism. We must fight. And I hope I finally found the right community to pursue those goals, as even CPUSA seems like a front group to me.
I think the implication is a front group of the Democratic Party, of the liberals. A comrade from Minneapolis said,
I'm a current member of the CPUSA, but I heard about the RCA, and you all seem more radical, which I'm here for.
Yeah, and it's great to see that these people are finding the RCA, because I actually just saw this recently in one of their draft organizational resolutions for their upcoming Congress. And they actually acknowledge the fact that all of their recent recruitment has been more or less accidental from their point of view. They write, mass public outreach and recruiting new members is where the rubber hits the road. While significant growth has been achieved in recent years, here again, most of it takes place online and is almost completely spontaneous. So that absolutely confirms capitalism is radicalizing millions of youth. Many thousands of youth are actively looking for a communist party to join. They wind up in the CPUSA, and then they quickly see that it's not a communist party and has not been a communist party for a very long time. So we absolutely want to reach this new layer of recruits in the CPUSA and show them that there is a party that's actually standing for the genuine ideas of Lenin.
Yes, I would say it's a very similar phenomenon to the growth of DSA, actually, because it's just people wanting to find something, and through no action of their own, both DSA and CPUSA grew because of the brand, because of the name, right? DSA at a time when Bernie Sanders was popular and you had the rise of democratic socialism. Those were the words that Bernie himself used, and people go online and find the DSA. And similarly, young people, if they're looking for communism, you type communism in your search engine and you might find the CPUSA. But those parties, those groups had no actual perspectives for what to do with those members, because they don't actually have a perspective of revolution, of actually ending capitalism. And there's a comrade in Atlanta who went through a similar experience of being disappointed by what he found in CPUSA. Let's hear from Comrade David.
I'm a server and bartender. I was born and raised here in Atlanta, and I went to college in Knoxville. But then in junior year, I decided I didn't want to finish a 4-year degree, so I came home and I'm applying to trade school instead. Well, I've always sort of been a communist, I guess. I didn't used to call myself one. As long as I've been politically aware, I've always felt like a leftist myself. I sort of went through phases. I used to call myself a socialist around 8th grade. Then I started to call myself a democratic socialist in 9th grade. But as I learned more and more, you just sort of start to realize that Democrats say one thing, but then nothing happens, and Republicans take more ground, which also led me to radicalize out of being a democratic socialist. Because I heard you mention DSA earlier, and that sort of plays into that. Well, and then the pandemic hitting really made me radicalize, considering that people like David Perdue got away scot-free, partying and philandering on a stupid yacht. Well, people were out of work, people couldn't buy basic things, and people were dying. That really did the last thing for me. So in freshman year of college, I started calling myself a communist and discussing Marxist views with friends and stuff. And this time I realized that I was fully a communist. I decided to see if I can get organized, instead of just sitting around and being an armchair communist. So I looked up CPUSA.
And unfortunately, what David found didn't really meet his expectations or allow him to be an active communist, really.
The thing is with the CPUSA is I, like many others, expected it to be a little more involved, considering it has communist in the name. Typically with communist parties, it involves some level of, working towards the revolution. At least that's the way I thought of it. But what I found out is it was more so just a mailing list. I just got lots of emails about it. And that got very old very quick because none of the emails were relevant to where I was living at. Like, for instance, I was in Knoxville originally for school when I joined that Black Google and Communist Party. I paid dues with them for about a year just to feel like I was a communist. There was no contacting me. Like, how the RCA will contact people, even if we don't have a branch specifically in that area, we'll send some comrades down to help get somebody set up for making a cell there, actually getting organized. But there was no such communication. And then same when I did move to Atlanta, when I finally left the party, because it was the same thing. I'm now back in a major city and there's still no getting organized. It just seemed like a social club, like a mailing list to say you're a communist. I'm still somehow on their mailing list right now.
And it wasn't just a question of disappointment with the level of activity, but of course also primarily with the class collaborationist policy of the group.
It almost felt like they were communist in name. They were more concerned with making sure Democrats get elected locally. I don't know about Leninism being huge within the CPUSA. For instance, with the RCA, it seems pretty clear with members that we've drawn a line with Joe Biden, right? That Democrats and Republicans both work to maintain capital. They both work for the ruling class. Democrats and Republicans across the board support the way law enforcement works in this country 100%. Like Atlanta's building its cop city here, championed by a so-called progressive. I don't think that a communist party should support a Democrat or Republican. I mean, they lost a member with me.
But luckily, our Atlanta comrades have been very prolific with their communist stickering, and David was able to find an actual communist party that he can be active with.
It was a pretty awesome little morning, too. I had just gotten a bagel with my girlfriend, who lives out of the city for now. She was coming to visit me, and we were just walking down the street, and all of a sudden I see this sticker with a QR code on it that said, "Are you communist? Then get organized." And Brandon, our branch secretary here in Atlanta, wasted zero time getting in contact with me. Immediately reached out to me. The RCA, day one, I have been a member for about a month. And already I feel like I've done a lot more progress towards actually getting something done than I ever have for the revolution. And we're talking about a month's time here. And I've got you in New York calling me just to hear what I have to say about the party, and that already shows initiative. This party actually gives me a lot of optimism. I don't know, I guess what I would say to current CPUSA members is get organized. There is a party that's being built. There are people that can help you build this party. If we don't organize and fight now, we're going to miss the boat for this generation of communists.
Well, I think at this point we should address another question we've been getting, and which you may be asking yourself while you were listening to this podcast. Are we Trotskyists? Just to quote from some of the YouTube comments that we've received, someone asked point blank,
"Is the Revolutionary Communists of America a Trotskyist party or a Leninist party that sees Trotsky as a good socialist figure?"
And of course, there's a lot of very, childish sort of interaction online around this question. You may be familiar with ice pick jokes. You can have a political debate with someone, but it just ends with an insult. And that's that. So, yeah, are we Trotskyist? What's the deal?
Well, yeah, of course we support Trotsky because he continued the methods of genuine Marxism and Leninism. And so we're Trotskyists in the same sense that we're Leninists, in the same sense that we're Marxists. It's all names attributed to theoreticians who are putting forth the same method. And if you read Trotsky's works, you see a clear, unbroken thread of continuation from Lenin's ideas, which Lenin died in 1924, and Trotsky continued on the fight for genuine Marxist policies in the world workers' movement. There's an enormous amount of confusion, as you talk about in many circles, over Trotsky's role in the Russian Revolution and his relation to Lenin. Suffice it to say, along with Lenin, Trotsky was one of the chief leaders of the Russian Revolution and the Bolshevik Party after 1917. In fact, during the early years of the Soviet Union, the early years after 1917, the Bolshevik Party was commonly known as the party of Lenin and Trotsky. The two were seen as by far the two principal leaders.
You shouldn't take our word for it. Even the very Stalinist leader of the British Communist Party in 1932 said the following: "Comrade Trotsky's name had always been associated in our minds with Comrade Lenin. Lenin and Trotsky, these were the names with which we conjured in all our thoughts and feelings about the Russian Revolution and the Communist International."
He actually organized the insurrection in the October Revolution. He built and led the Red Army during the Civil War. which lasted from 1918 to 1920. Over 20 foreign armies invaded the Soviet Union to try to crush the Russian Revolution, and Trotsky successfully led the fight against that counter-revolution, led the fight to preserve and maintain the workers' state. Trotsky also drafted many of the key documents for the Communist International, including the manifesto of the Communist International. And so, he and Lenin worked side by side after 1917 to build the Communist International and to defend and administer the Soviet Union. And after Lenin's death in 1924, Trotsky lived on to continue Lenin's fight against bureaucracy in the Soviet Union, for a class-independent policy in the communist parties across the world, above all for internationalism, for spreading the Russian Revolution, for spreading the socialist revolution across the world. And so if there's any Leninists right now who are listening to this and are skeptical, suspicious of Trotsky based on things that you've read online, the first thing I'll say is that there's a false idea that sometimes circulates that Trotsky denounced the Soviet Union, or we've received some questions, messages saying, I hear you totally write off all past achievements of the Soviet Union, the Cuban Revolution, these kinds of confusions.
From what I've heard, you guys are Trotskyists who denounce current and past socialist projects. Those sort of purity demands make me not want to take you seriously. How can we achieve our goals as communists if we don't work with socialist projects that have actually achieved some semblance of success and make compromises to exist within a world dominated by capital? How do you address these criticisms, and how do you plan to convince other communists like me, who see such purity testing as an appendage of left anti-communism, that you are the right party to work with?
Bears no relation to Trotsky's actual approach to this. Trotsky wrote a book in 1936 called The Revolution Betrayed. It's an excellent must-read work to understand the Soviet Union. And then in the introduction, or in the first chapter, he's sort of summarizing what the Russian Revolution had achieved thus far. He says,
gigantic achievement in industry, enormously promising beginnings in agriculture, an extraordinary growth of the old industrial cities and a building of new ones, a rapid increase of the numbers of workers, a rise in the cultural level and cultural demands. Such are the indubitable results of the October Revolution. Even if the Soviet Union, as a result of internal difficulties, external blows, and the mistakes of leadership, were to collapse, there would remain as an earnest of the future this indestructible fact that thanks solely to a proletarian revolution, a backward country has achieved in less than 10 years successes unexampled in history.
And so that puts Trotsky's position quite clearly. He was analyzing how in conditions of isolation, economic backwardness, and cultural backwardness, the Russian Revolution degenerated and a bureaucratic caste around Stalin arose. But he explained that nonetheless, the main conquest of the Russian Revolution, the nationalized planned economy, remained and was getting remarkable results. And he explained that the example set by the Russian working class will always remain a positive example of the workers taking power.
And not just in the abstract, obviously, especially in the context of World War II about to break out, he always stood unconditionally for the defense of the Soviet Union against any invasion, certainly against capitalist restoration, which cannot be said, by the way, of the Russian bureaucracy, which eventually ended up reverting back to capitalism, right? And plundering state assets for their own enrichment. And so Lenin and Trotsky both predicted that if the revolution remained isolated, it would be doomed eventually to defeat. And certainly the Soviet Union prevailed for a lot longer. It was the workers of Russia made a huge effort to play the prominent role in defeating Nazism, and that allowed it to basically exist for even longer than many would have imagined. But eventually, it was one way or the other. Either you had actual genuine workers' democracy, workers' control of the means of production, or there would be a restoration of capitalism, and that did play out. I think Lenin said that he would give up the Russian Revolution if you could have a successful German Revolution in the 1920s. That really points to the genuine revolutionary internationalism that both Lenin and Trotsky advocated for. which is totally antithetical to this idea of socialism in one country.
Yeah, definitely. And Lenin did not mince words on this. He did not. He was not vague on the need for internationalism. He actually continuously explained what you just said, which is that if the socialist revolution didn't spread into Europe, then Russia would be doomed. Just to give one example, he said this in March of 1918.
Regarded from the world historical point of view, there would doubtlessly be no hope of the ultimate victory of our revolution if it were to remain alone, if there were no revolutionary movements in other countries. When the Bolshevik Party tackled the job alone, it did so in the firm conviction that the revolution was maturing in all countries and that in the end, no matter what difficulties we experienced, no matter what defeats were in store for us, the world's socialist revolution would come because it is maturing and will reach maturity. I repeat, our salvation from all these difficulties is an all-Europe revolution.
So that makes it very clear. It's not an abstract thing. It's not a preference, but it's very concrete. To build socialism, you have to have the industrialization and wealth and technology of advanced capitalism on a world scale. The whole point of scientific socialism is that it's not something you can just build at any time or place in history. And so Trotsky explained how, because the Russian Revolution did remain isolated, the basis of scarcity, the low economic basis of the Soviet Union, led to bureaucratization. And in The Revolution Betrayed, he has this quote, which I think summarizes it well.
The basis of bureaucratic rule is the poverty of society and objects of consumption, with the resulting struggle of each against all. When there is enough goods in a store, the purchasers can come whenever they want to. When there is little goods, the purchasers are compelled to stand in line. When the lines are very long, it is necessary to appoint a policeman to keep order. Such is the starting point of the power of the Soviet bureaucracy.
I think it's true to say, though, that Lenin saw the seeds of this bureaucratic degeneration.
Definitely.
And toward the end of his life, in the early 1920s, Lenin was preparing to carry out a struggle against the bureaucratization of the Soviet state apparatus and also explicitly against Stalin as his successor. And maybe we can link some of these things. You don't need to trust us. I don't think you should trust random internet tweets or whatever. I think you can read Lenin's words directly from the source, from Lenin's testaments and some of his other later writings, as well as reading Trotsky yourself. Just pick it up and read it and see if you agree or not. Make up your mind for yourself, straight from the source.
Yeah, definitely. To give an example of what you just said with Lenin's writings on this, this was one of the main themes in his final political writings. It was his final political struggle. He said at one point,
if we take Moscow with its 4,700 communists in responsible positions, and if we take that huge bureaucratic machine, that giant heap, we must ask, who is directing whom? I doubt very much whether it can be truthfully said that the communists are directing that heap. To tell the truth, they are not directing. They are being directed.
In another instance, his final speech at the Communist International, he says,
we took over the old machinery of state, and that was our misfortune. Very often this machinery operates against us. In 1917, after we seized power, the government officials sabotaged us. This frightened us very much, and we pleaded, please come back. They all came back, but that was our misfortune.
And he goes on to make the same point about how it's really not the communists that are directing the state apparatus, but the bureaucrats in the state apparatus that are driving the communists, and they're driving the direction of the state. So Trotsky lived long enough to see this play out to its full, but Lenin was absolutely aware and actively fighting to combat this growth of bureaucratization of the Soviet Union at the end of his life.
The sort of most explicit attack on Stalin and the party bureaucracy by Lenin is better, fewer, but better. And here's a quote that gives another idea of how Lenin approached this.
Our state apparatus is so deplorable, not to say wretched, that we must first think very carefully how to combat its defects, bearing in mind that these defects are rooted in the past, which, although it has been overthrown, has not yet been overcome.
So yeah, this was Lenin's approach as well. His whole demeanor in the late years of his life when the Bolsheviks were in power, but under siege and encirclement by imperialism, he explained the problems very bluntly. And he explained that the solution was the world socialist revolution. So he said, for instance, this is from January 24th of 1918.
We are far from having completed even the transitional period from capitalism to socialism. We have never cherished the hope that we could finish it without the aid of the international proletariat. We never had any illusions on that score.
Not a trace from Lenin of just all is well, we're building socialism, there's no problems in the Soviet Union. He understood the only way to spread the revolution was to be completely clear about the situation facing the working class. And I think this is a really key point. And the Bolsheviks didn't just put that out into the world. They didn't just say, we need to spread the revolution. They did everything they could to build the organized forces of communism in every other country, to build communist parties, because they understood that revolutions were coming elsewhere in Europe, in North America, across the world. And so in 1919, they founded the Communist International. And the Communist International was really, I would say, the high point of the organized communist movement so far. The early years of the Communist International were a high point because essentially delegates came from dozens of countries across the world. The Russian Revolution had starkly polarized the labor movement across the world. There were left-wing splits from the socialist parties, and the advanced workers across Europe and across the world supported the Russian Revolution. So they sent delegates to the founding Congress and to the next 3 Congresses of the Communist International to get trained up in Bolshevism. Lenin and Trotsky and the Bolsheviks, they would discuss any and all questions facing the movement and clarify the real approach of Bolshevism. And so this really served as a world school of communism. They understood that they needed to train communist leaderships across the world to actually spread the revolution. That process was cut across by Stalinism, but the legacy of the early years of the Communist International remains, and the debates and the documents and the theses and everything from that experience is still part of our theoretical arsenal for building the communist movement today.
That is why we are founding the Revolutionary Communist International. We are Leninists. We are therefore revolutionary internationalists. And we absolutely think that we need to build communist parties around the world with a common program. We're going to have the founding conference of the Revolutionary Communist International this summer. You can actually attend online, and we'll post the link in the description. And also the link to the manifesto of the RCI, which is a founding document. And we are confident in the perspective that we're at the beginning of a new era of world revolution that we are preparing for. We have groups and sections in over 40 countries around the world, and that is the aim of the Revolutionary Communist International, like that of the Third Communist International, to carry out the revolution worldwide.